Hello, thanks for coming to the webinar. My name is Mike Palmedo, and I'm a fellow at the American University Program on Information Justice and Intellectual Property. Today I'm presenting a working paper published by Boston University's GDP Center earlier this year. It's on data exclusivity and pharmaceutical prices. Just to start off, what is data exclusivity? When originator drug firms invent new medicines, they present clinical trial data allowing to get marketing approval, which typically, and when generic firms apply, they typically rely on the originator's clinical trial data, allowing them to bring products to the market at a lower cost, which are then passed on to consumers. Data exclusivity is a period of time during which generic firms cannot obtain marketing approval for their products based on originator firm data. This blocks them from the market. It's a layer of intellectual property protection separate from the patent right. It's not required by the TRIPS agreement, but it's required by many free trade agreements, including those with the United States. So with that in mind, my study starts with the idea that to study the impact of trade agreement provisions, you don't want to look at the agreements themselves and when they took effect. You want to look at the types of legal provisions required by trade agreements, but differently, you want to look at patent extensions or data exclusivity or anything else in domestic laws, and it doesn't matter whether the law was changed to comply with a FTA or for some other reason. And studies that look at TRIPS plus legal provisions rather than TRIPS plus FTAs often find sizable impacts. Second use patents, which are often requirements to grant patents on new uses of already patented material, have been found to delay generic entry in Chile. They blocked generic abacavir in the Ukraine. They've added around 7 years to the effective patent life of certain drugs in the US. Patent extensions beyond 20 years required by TRIPS have cost Australia's pharmaceutical benefits scheme approximately 260 million Australian dollars. They've led to higher prices of specific drugs in Europe, and they've kept weakly innovative drugs from having generic competition in Canada. And there are some previous data exclusivity studies that I want to mention. Data exclusivity created almost $400 million in expenses for the Colombian public health system, and raised the price of one particular drug in the US from just a few cents to $5 per pill. And it blocked generics in Guatemala and Jordan after they implemented FTAs with the US. But most of the studies so far that have looked at the impact of TRIPS plus provisions have looked at either one country or a few countries or a few particular drugs in some cases. I wanted to take a different approach and look at the impact of test data exclusivity on pharmaceutical prices in a large set of countries. And I did that using trade data. So the first thing you need to do for a study like that is you need to find a set of countries which implemented data exclusivity and find out when they did so. And for that, I used a report from the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Associations, or IFPMA. They have a 2011 report that shows when a set of 42 countries, well, it describes the law on data prescription protection in 42 countries, and whether or not that law includes exclusivity. With those laws in hand, I went to the World Intellectual Property Organization's database and got the years when all of the laws went into effect. And the result is this timeline, which shows which countries are in my data set and when they, if and when they implemented data exclusivity. You see Hong Kong and the USA have had it for quite some time. Most of the other countries implemented it in the 2000s, and there were 7 countries that by publication of this IFPMA report 2011 hadn't implemented it yet at all. So they serve as a sort of control, as well as countries in their observations from time periods before they did it. The second thing you need for this sort of test, this sort of study, is price data. And price data across many countries over time is scarce. And proprietary data from IQVIA is super, super expensive. But trade data is freely available, allowing one to compare prices in many countries, at least for traded drugs. So the UN's COMTRADE database reports the annual value in US dollars in annual quantity in kilograms of commercial pharmaceutical imports as recorded by border authorities. Unlike published prices, which may be subject to further discounts or markups, COMTRADE reports the actual amounts of money paid at the wholesale level for the shipments of products. Annual data for both value and volume is available for many countries from the 1990s through the present. COMTRADE data is disaggregated by product class according to a system of tariff classification known as the harmonized system, or HS class for short. And this allows you to see the changes in prices of different classes of drugs. So my study's pricing indicator is going to be the average annual price per kilogram paid by each country each year from 1996 to 2010, which is a period of time which covers TRIPS implementation for most of the countries, and the prices are disaggregated by the 6-digit HS class. And this slide shows the average price per kilogram per class in the mean column, and it varies a lot from one class to the next, ranging from just under $30 for imports of medicines containing vitamins to over $250 for medicines containing certain types of hormones or antibiotics, and for types of insulin. But we really want to see how prices changed over time and how this was different once countries had data exclusivity enacted in their laws, which brings us to this slide, which is really the most important slide of the whole presentation. It's the main idea. This figure compares annual average price per kilogram paid by importing countries each year by countries without data exclusivity and with data exclusivity over the 15-year period. And it's clear that the price increased at a higher rate in the countries that had enacted data exclusivity. But to test the size and significance of this relationship between data exclusivity and the growth of import prices, I do a series of panel regressions. Regressions are set up with HS class country pairs as the panels. The dependent variable is the logged price per kilogram. So the table shows how each of the separate independent variables is associated with price changes in price per kilogram. This first set of regressions, I use a dummy variable to indicate whether a country had data exclusivity in a given year. There's going to be a second set of regressions I'll touch on briefly that considers differing levels, differing strengths of data protection. But for now, we're just looking at whether or not a country had it in their laws or not. And the most important things in this table are the coefficients on the variable year times data exclusivity. This shows the difference in the rate at which pharmaceutical prices per kilogram changed in countries that had data exclusivity relative to those that did not. And in each column is a different regression, and in each of them, the coefficient on year times data exclusivity is positive and significant. This shows that the rate of growth for prices in this set of countries was higher and statistically significantly higher when countries had data exclusivity. And if we look at the first column, this shows the results with the overall time trend as an independent variable. And we'll start by looking at countries without data exclusivity. Now, the coefficient on year is 0.039, which means countries without data exclusivity each year saw, on average, drug prices grow by 3.9%. To get the average yearly increase in drug prices for countries with data exclusivity, you take the sum of the first two. Basically, you add the coefficients of the two circled numbers with stars next to them. And for these countries with data exclusivity, drug import prices increased 7.6% each year. Though the difference may seem small year to year, it compounds. So over 15 years at these rates of growth, the price in a theoretical country without data exclusivity would increase 78%. The corresponding price in a theoretical country with data exclusivity would increase by 200%. One quick thing to note here is that the control value variables for GDP per capita and logged kilograms make sense and are significant. So the overall model seems to make sense. Moving on to the next regression, here I add 2 additional controls for things to do with the health system: out-of-pocket spending as a percent of total spending and health expenditures as a percent of GDP. They enter in significantly, and the coefficient on year times data exclusivity is still positive, indicating you still see that premium. This also, due to data availability, has a smaller set of countries, of years, smaller set of observations, but you still see the significant relationship holds. In the last 2 columns, I no longer use a linear time trend. I treat time differently by adding fixed effects per year. And the take-home point here is, again, the relationship is similar. You still have a positive, significant relationship between data exclusivity and the growth of drug prices. So analysis in that previous section was based on whether or not a country had data exclusivity in any form. It didn't really consider differences between countries' data exclusivity regimes. So now let's look at a metric that measures differences in data exclusivity from one country to the next. So this is the Index of Data Exclusivity and Access created by Sheikh in 2016, and it quantifies differences between countries' data exclusivity laws. It's derived from 25 questions within 4 categories, which look at the strength and the duration of data exclusivity, as well as whether or not there were limitations and exceptions to data exclusivity. It's meant to evaluate national laws based on their orientation towards access to medicine. Now, I'm looking at stronger data exclusivity. So what I do is I use the inverse of this in a series of regressions. And I do that in a set of 21 countries that are both in my set of countries and in the ideas set of countries. And here they are. These are the countries in both sets. The inverse ideas score ranges from a low of 0.4 in Peru after it implemented its trade agreement obligations to 2% for Hong Kong, which has always had strict data protection. So I returned to my set of regressions, but instead of using a dummy variable to indicate whether a country has enacted data exclusivity, I use the ideas score. So still, if before a country implements data exclusivity, in those years, there's a 0, but once they implement it, it won't just be a 1, it'll be that inverse ideas score. Now the sample size is smaller because there are fewer countries and fewer years in this set of tests, but the overall fit of the model is similar. Control variables still have the expected signs. Most of them remain significant. And overall, the coefficients on year times the inverse ideas index are the same. It does become insignificant in the second column, which is probably due to the smaller sample size. The largest difference, the coefficients in columns 1 and 3 are very similar to what I was using a double W variable. The largest difference is found in column 4, where the coefficient on year times ideas is almost 1 percentage point higher, which could indicate that in countries with stronger data exclusivity, you see even more of a price hike. However, the real take-home point here is that with the different measurement of data exclusivity, you still see that significant positive relationship. So I'm getting towards the end. Now I want to comment on potential methodological issues, some due to the use of COMTRADE and some on legal issues. So COMTRADE's strength is that it has lots of data from many countries, many years. However, there are issues. First is that it relies on classes of drugs, and it doesn't allow you to see the impact on any particular drug. Changes to intellectual property law will delay generic entry for individual drugs as they reach the market, rather than affecting entire classes of drugs at once. Furthermore, its reliance on large categories of drugs that are basically tariff categories might not make sense with health categories. You can't look at, with the exception of insulin, you can't look at specific treatment areas. Like you can't look at anti-cancer drugs, for instance. It doesn't have data on branded versus generic imports, and it being trade data, it doesn't have any information about locally produced pharmaceuticals. And since different countries have different shares of locally produced pharmaceuticals in their market, that's important missing information. There are also legal issues. First, countries may implement data exclusivity while making simultaneous changes to other potentially impactful IP or health laws. This may be particularly relevant if they're implementing an FTA. For instance, when Guatemala was implementing its US FTA obligations in 2006, it began having data exclusivity, it widened the scope of patentability, and it introduced patent linkage and made some other changes all at the same time. So it's difficult to tease out what was really due to data exclusivity versus something else. Finally,
Michael, session will close very quickly, maybe in any second. I suggest to close and resume because
okay,
I
okay. Laws may be on the books but not enforced. And my conclusion is that a good way to study the impact of TRIPS plus FTAs is to look at the domestic laws that would meet the obligations rather than the FTAs themselves. A better mapping of the legal landscapes would be useful. In this study, data exclusivity was associated with a higher rate of drug price growth. And finally, COMTRADE data could be used to analyze the impact of other types of TRIPS plus provisions in large sets of countries. That being said, COMTRADE data is not perfect. The link to my working paper is at the bottom of this slide.